This is not the first time that the public celebration of Mass has been impossible in Australia. In fact, it's the 5th time. For the Aborigines of the east coast of Australia, first contact with Christianity was the arrival of James Cook's expedition, exactly 250 years ago next month. Some years later, colonists arrived, most of them Christians, some Catholic, convict or free. On assuming office, Governor Phillip swore, among other things, that there was no transubstantiation in the sacrament of the Holy Table. The Mass was outlawed in the colony for the next 15 years. It fell to the laity to maintain their faith and devotion. Once priests arrived amongst the political prisoners from the 1798 Irish uprising, there may have been some secret masses. But by 1803, there were over 2,000 Catholics in the colony, and Governor King was authorised to appoint the convict priest, Father James Dixon, to offer Mass publicly on successive Sundays in Sydney, Parramatta and Windsor. But when the Irish Catholics conducted a second rebellion, this time at Rouse Hill in Sydney, the Mass was again prohibited. Though the chaplain of a passing French or Portuguese ship might occasionally offer Mass, it was again up to lay Catholics to pray as best they could and transmit the faith to their children. Then in 1817, Father Jeremiah O'Flynn arrived, declaring that he was the official Catholic chaplain. He proceeded to say Mass unimpeded for several months for the now 6,000 Catholics faithful. But when no official papers arrived for him, Governor Macquarie had him shipped out. O'Flynn famously left a consecrated host behind, which became the centre of Catholic devotional life in Sydney. But the Mass itself was effectively excluded for the 3rd time. Australia's first official Catholic chaplains, Fathers Terry and Connolly, arrived 200 years ago this May. A decade and a half later, John Beat Paulding was appointed as the first bishop. So regular Mass was secured, and churches, priests and faithful multiplied thereafter. The practising rate of Catholics gradually rose from around 1 in 10 to 1 in 3. And practising or not, Catholics were pleased Mass was now available. But in 1919, the Spanish flu infected 40% of the Australian population and took 15,000 lives, many of them young adults. Churches were closed. Mass was held outdoors until all public gatherings were prohibited. People then prayed at home while their clergy cared for the sufferers. Archbishop Kelly got into a stoush with the government over whether priests could visit the dying at the North Head quarantine station. But the public celebration of Mass was forbidden for the 4th time in our history, if only for a few months. After the virus had passed, the number of churches and those practising rose steadily until by the 1950s, 2/3 of Catholics were at Mass on Sunday. The 5th time that public Mass was prohibited in Australia was this week past, when the COVID-19 pandemic led to similar public health measures to those applied a century ago. Every time we've faced this before, the lay faithful have maintained their faith and devotion. Every time the Church has bounced back after the crisis, stronger than before, more hungry for the Eucharist and with higher rates of Mass attendance. How will we respond this time? And what will it mean for the future of the Church after we have passed through this vale of tears? The history of Israel is of a people who knew they were God's favourites, yet all too often strayed away from him and suffered the physical, emotional and spiritual consequences. But today, through Ezekiel, God promises, "I am going to open your graves and raise you from death, my people, and put my spirit in you so you shall live." We see this playing out in the story of Lazarus. First, we're told he was sick. Then he's dead and buried. Then, in the words of the King James Bible, he stinketh. But at the Lord's command, Lazarus is liberated from the grave. If Jesus is God's final word, and he is the resurrection and the life, then life, not death, is God's last word for us. This pattern of birth, death, and rebirth is what Christians expect for God's favourites like Israel, for Jesus' friends like Lazarus, and for the Church herself. She's been through this many times. Each of us also goes through various beginnings, ends, and revivals, various conversions, diversions, and reversions. Jesus tells us that Lazarus' story and ours will not end in death, but in God's glory. So we are not trapped in some eternal cosmic circle with no progress, or some temporary cosmic recycling with no hope. Jesus' promise of resurrection is not just a dim, distant hope, as Mary of Bethany first thought, but an already present reality. What next for our Church and for each of us as we pass through this pandemic and, God willing, emerge on the other side? Will our bodily health have been adversely affected, or our character? Will our economy experience depression, or our hearts? Will our religious faith and practice be shattered? Or will we have demonstrated the nobler side of our natures under grace? Courage and compassion, prayer and pastoral care, a willingness to share with others. Will our Church have shone in this darkness through our intercession for the world, our health care for the sick, our funerals for the dead, our welfare for the unemployed, our support for the isolated, our hope for the despairing, our pastoral care for all. Today, Christ promises that this hard Lent is only the beginning for the promise that we can join his Easter. That the church, dead and bound with stuff, will be unbound and refreshed as so often in the past. And that each of us, having endured with patience and love, will be plucked from the jaws of death and let go free.